watching France 24. It's 6 a.m. here in Paris, 1 a.m. in Brazil. The headlines. Brazil's lower house of Congress has voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff. The case now goes to the Senate, which could decide to put the president on trial for illegally using money from the central bank to hide a gaping budget deficit. At least 272 people are dead after the biggest earthquake in decades hits Ecuador. A state of emergency has been announced in 6 provinces as survivors struggle to get access to basics like water and shelter. And François Hollande visits Egypt in an effort to deepen ties across energy, infrastructure and culture. But there's one thing he couldn't agree on with the Egyptian president: human rights. Thanks for being with us this hour for Live from Paris. I'm Belle Lupton. Coming up on the programme, we'll be telling you how Morocco's automobile industry is speeding ahead thanks to investment from car companies, French car companies. And in today's focus, we're in northern China at the coalface of the government's decision to close 1,000 mines this year. We'll be finding out what that means for the 1.3 million people likely to lose their jobs. The fight is now in the courts, the street and the Senate. The words of Brazil's ruling party leader in the lower house of Congress after lawmakers voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff. 3 days of fiery debate ended just a few hours ago with the votes reaching 324, the 2/3 majority needed to advance the case to the upper house. The Senate will now consider the motion and whether to hold a trial during which Rousseff would step aside. She's accused of illegally using money from state-owned banks to conceal a gaping budget deficit, all in an effort to bolster her re-election bid. Shirley Sitbon has this report.
This was the decisive moment. 341 Brazilian MPs had already voted for Dilma Rousseff's impeachment for allegedly manipulating budget accounts. The opposition needed just one more lawmaker to support the motion. This was their man.
Brazil, we're moving towards a new future.
Outside Parliament, thousands of Brazilians held 2 competing protests. One supporting Rousseff, the other calling for her impeachment.
This corruption must be stopped. The government thinks that Brazilians should accept it all. We're here for a better Brazil, with better politicians. We are here as a family to support that. Out Dilma. There's been enough theft.
Those who support the president say that she hasn't been charged with corruption, but that hundreds of MPs have been, including many of those who voted against Rousseff.
I am here to defend democracy and the rights of the state. It is not possible that half a dozen thieves take over power that legitimately belongs to Dilma Rousseff.
Now that the lower house has given a green light to impeachment, another vote will be held in the Senate. If the upper house confirms the impeachment, the vice president would take over the top job.
Well, our correspondent Richard Thompson is in Brazil and has been following the vote. Now, he joins us on the phone from Rio de Janeiro. Richard, so the lower house has voted to impeach Rousseff, but what happens next?
Well, as we heard there in Shirley's report, the motion now has to go to the Senate, and there a simple majority is all that's required for a trial to go ahead. That's 41 senators out of 81. Now that vote is expected around mid-May. Before that, the Senate has to form a special commission to investigate, to examine the issue, and to issue a report with its take on the impeachment question. And if a majority votes for Rousseff to stand trial, Rousseff would be suspended for up to 180 days, during which she would be tried by the Senate on those claims that she fiddled accounts to mask the extent of the budget deficit. Now, the outcome of that trial, which could take months, would determine whether Rousseff is permanently dismissed or whether she's able to retake office. So this vote by the lower house, which has just happened, is important. It keeps the momentum with the pro-impeachment camp, but it's not decisive. This is really going to be decided in the Senate.
And of course, Dilma Rousseff is still saying that she's the democratically elected president. She says that she's the victim of a political plot, and she's even calling it a coup d'etat. Why does she say that? What gives her the idea to say that?
Well, yes, she says that she's the victim of a plot led by Vice President Michel Temer and the Speaker of the House, Eduardo Cunha, and they happen to be second and third in line for Rousseff's job if she's suspended. And to make things even more complicated, Michel Temer is at risk of impeachment for himself for allegedly trying to hide the budget deficit as well, while Cunha is being investigated over claims he siphoned off millions from the state oil firm Petrobras. So while some are feeling euphoric about the impeachment process against Rousseff moving forward, the alternatives are also questionable, one might say, and for many Brazilians, deeply unpopular.
Thank you. That was Richard Thompson in Rio de Janeiro for us. Now, moving to Ecuador, where the death toll keeps rising. More than 270 people now thought to have died in the biggest earthquake the country has seen in decades. As hope fades for finding survivors still trapped under the rubble, thoughts are turning to basic needs like water and shelter for those picking up the pieces of their lives. A state of emergency has been announced in 6 provinces. And we can now speak to our correspondent, Carolina Loza-Leon, in the Ecuadorian capital, Quito. Carolina, can you tell us what's the very latest on the rescue efforts there?
President Correa addressed the nation a few minutes ago, in which he mentioned the death toll about being around 272, and it is expected to rise considerably in the next few days. Regarding the current situation, rescuing people from the rubble is the main priority from the government. There's a deployment of aid and foreign teams, especially from Mexico and Colombia, that are with operations going underway right now in the worst hit areas. That would be the coastal provinces.
And Carolina, what are the main challenges being faced on the ground?
Apparently, a lot of the roads have been completely destroyed with the earthquake in the hardest hit areas. So it's an inadequate infrastructure first to reach the people that need the help the most. And also a lot of the structure in these areas, because these are areas that have been, that are poor, many of the areas are very poor. This structure and how the houses have been built are very susceptible to collapse. So one has to be very careful when arriving to provide aid, and especially in rescue operations. And also the delivery of efficient aid. There's been an outpour of aid and supplies given by Ecuadorians all throughout the country. The president on his press conference mentioned this and thanked the Ecuadorian people. However, how efficient this aid is going to be supplied in the next few days is crucial for the rescue operations going right now.
Thank you, Carolina. That was our correspondent in Quito, in Ecuador. Meanwhile, rescue efforts are continuing in Japan after last week's earthquakes, in which 42 people died. The US military is joining Japanese teams who've been struggling to feed hundreds of thousands of people left homeless after 2 powerful quakes on successive nights. 11 people are still missing, and many areas remain cut off by landslides which have damaged roads. The southern Kumamoto region is an important manufacturing hub, and Japan's economy is likely to be dealt a blow as giants like Toyota, Sony and Honda have suspended production there. Now, the topic of human rights became a sticking point in the French president's visit to Egypt over the weekend. François Hollande was there in an effort to deepen ties with the Egyptian president. But in a press conference, the two were at loggerheads over the importance of human rights in the fight against terrorism. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi offered his condolences to the family of an Italian student kidnapped and tortured to death in Cairo in February. But he said Egypt should not be expected to abide by European standards of human rights, given the turmoil in the region. Here's what Hollande had to say in response.
We must fight against both the causes and consequences of terrorism. This requires strength, but it also implies, and I say it here again in Cairo, that there is a state and a state of law. And this is what France means when it speaks of human rights, because human rights are not a constraint. Human rights are also a way to fight against terrorism, since security is assured.
French President François Hollande speaking there. Now, our correspondent Sharif Abdul Kudus has been following the visit and spoke to us from Cairo.
Following talks between Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and French President François Hollande, the two leaders held a joint press conference that was dominated in large part by the issue of human rights. French President Hollande said he did raise this issue with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, whose government has come under harsh criticism by rights groups for cracking down on any and all opposition. He specifically mentioned the cases of Giulio Regini, the Italian PhD student who was killed earlier this year, and French citizen Eric Lang, who died in 2013 in police custody. Sisi said Egypt is a country with the rule of law, but he also repeatedly spoke about attempts, he said, by an evil group to take down state institutions one by one. They also discussed regional issues, including Libya, Syria, and Yemen. On Libya, both leaders talked about supporting the unity government there, and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi spoke about supporting the Libyan National Army headed by Khalifa Haftar and calling for an arms embargo to be lifted on Libya.
Our correspondent in Egypt there. And in nearby Syria, the renewal of violence continued over the weekend, with 10 children among 22 people killed by rebel shelling on the northern city of Aleppo. That's according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Now, this despite a partial ceasefire that went into effect in late February and a second round of peace talks in Geneva. The opposition delegation threatened to walk out on Sunday unless there's progress on a political transition, as Micaele Cabrera reports.
A fragile truce in Syria has been holding for more than 50 days. But fighting has surged in Aleppo in the past days. Civilians have been killed as government forces target the al-Qaeda-linked al-Nusra Front. In negotiations in Geneva to end the 5-year-old war, opposition members have accused Damascus of violating the truce. Mohammed Alouche, one of the leaders of Jaish al-Islam, which controls a Damascus suburb, called for retaliation.
The regime has kept violating the truce. Over 51 days, we've seen more than 2,000 violations, which represents almost 2 violations an hour. This means that the regime has put an end to the truce. I call for a response to the aggression of the regime with force to prevent it from entering new territory.
In an internet message to fighters on the ground, another prominent opposition figure, Assad al-Zaoubi, the chief negotiator of the High Negotiations Committee in Geneva, also urged rebels to strike back.
We are upset with the rebels inside Syria. We have never asked them to be silent against every wrong by the regime. If the regime targets them with 1 missile, they must respond with 10, and they must gain control of as many areas as possible. They must take advantage of the ceasefire as the regime has done.
These comments have raised concerns that the opposition could quit the talks in Geneva. They refuse to discuss any possibility of Bashar al-Assad staying in power, and the government rules out any talk of him leaving.
Now, oil prices have plunged after the world's top producers failed to reach an agreement on capping output at a meeting in Doha over the weekend. Prices had been slightly boosted by hopes OPEC and other major producers like Russia would be able to agree to freeze output. But when Iran boycotted the meeting, top producer Saudi Arabia walked away from the agreement. It's a milestone in French-Iranian relations. The first Air France flight between Paris and Tehran landed in the Islamic Republic on Sunday. It brings to an end an 8-year freeze on direct flights between the two capitals, and it may mark a new start for Iran, whose economy has been crippled by years of sanctions aimed at stopping its nuclear program. Carl Brown has more.
Touchdown in Tehran. The first flight to arrive in Iran direct from Paris in 8 years is being celebrated as a diplomatic victory. The French transport minister and a business delegation arrived on the inaugural flight, helping to thaw relations between France and Iran after years of tensions surrounding the Islamic Republic's nuclear program.
Our relations have certainly known difficulties, but the direct links between us have always been maintained, including at the peak of political tensions.
The freeze on flights was part of a number of crushing economic sanctions imposed by the West to stop Iran from advancing its nuclear program. Years in the making, an agreement with world powers led to a lifting of sanctions in January, leading to a resumption of travel and business between the Islamic Republic and the West.
We will start with 3 weekly flights, which seems appropriate for businessmen and tourists. And then we'll see. The goal is to increase the frequency to have 7 flights a week. In other words, daily.
Resumption of flights caused controversy at Air France earlier this month when some flight attendants objected to rules requiring female staff to cover their hair with a scarf and wear trousers whenever they're outside of the plane in Iran.
In Belgium, thousands of people turned out for a march against terror and hatred in the capital. They're there to remember the 32 victims of the terrorist attacks that rocked the city last month. The procession had been due to be held a week after the attacks, but officials asked for it to be postponed because of the security threat. Aurore Dupuis reports.
Holding flowers and the Belgian flag. These protesters have been told not to bring any backpacks or bags for security reasons. Thousands have poured into the streets of Brussels, marching against terror and hatred.
We want to look forward into the future and ask the question which kind of society we want in response to the terror attacks. And I think at this moment it's very crucial to ask if we want a society like this in opposition, or if we want a society like this in unity.
Last month, suicide bombers triggered their explosives at the international airport and at a metro station, leaving 32 people dead. The victims' relatives, as well as rescue workers and transport employees, are leading Sunday's peace protest. They insisted on marching through the neighbourhood of Molenbeek, home to several terror suspects.
We have to show that we want to recreate a connection between all cultures, between all the people living in this city. I'm a head teacher in a secondary school where there are many Muslim children. I think it's important for them to feel we want to create a new world with them.
The march was supposed to be held just after the bomb attacks, but it had been cancelled for security concerns.
A reminder of our top stories here on France 24. Brazil's lower house of Congress has voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff. The case now goes to the Senate, which could decide to put the president on trial for illegally using money from the central bank to hide a gaping budget deficit. At least 272 people are dead after the biggest earthquake in decades hits Ecuador. A state of emergency has been announced in 6 provinces as survivors struggle to get access to basics like water and shelter. And François Hollande visits Egypt in an effort to deepen ties across energy, infrastructure and culture. But there's one thing he couldn't agree on with the Egyptian president: human rights. Time for a quick look at business now. Morocco's automobile industry. That's where we're starting, because it's speeding ahead thanks to investment from French car companies. Renault's factory in Tangier is the biggest in North Africa. And not to be outdone, PSA Peugeot Citroën's new factory is set to begin production in Morocco in 2019. Automobiles have become the country's top export in the past few years, and it's expanding to become one of the most important industries in the economy, as Julia Kim reports. I'm sorry, we seem to have lost that package. If that's all right, we'll take a quick look at the markets now. So we're seeing, first of all, in Asia, here's how the markets closed. We're seeing falls across Asia after oil-producing countries failed to reach that agreement on supply levels at the weekend. Japanese shares on the Nikkei are seeing the biggest drop, down almost 3%, as investors gauge the impact of the earthquake on Saturday morning. Time now for reporters, and in this edition we're in Dikili. Now this coastal town on Turkey's west coast is a fishing hub, but some trawlermen now are scared to cast their nets because they know they may haul up from the sea dead bodies. Migrants have flooded Dikili. Our reporter met with many from Afghanistan, but there are hundreds from elsewhere as well. And for some, this has become a business opportunity, profiting from the basic needs of those desperate people. Sales of life jackets are booming. Watching, even worrying about the fate of human traffic before their eyes, the fishermen of Dikili continue their work, wondering what they might catch in their nets. Our report today is by Sophie Nivelle-Cardinal.
Although Greek waters are less than 10 kilometers away, the Aegean crossing has become the deadliest route for migrants in the world. It has claimed more than 350 lives since the beginning of the year.
In winter, you can't trust the sea. The weather I fear most in winter is when the sea is calm and it's cloudy. It can turn bad in 10 minutes, and the sea can take you down that fast.
For the migrants, Turkey is just a transit point on a very long journey. Last year, more than 800,000 people came this way on the road to Europe. Even though there is a new deal with the European Union, even though borders are closing, hundreds have still been trying to cross. The meeting point is at an abandoned coastal resort. Some have been waiting to make the crossing for days.
I can't cross because some problem, this big sea.
Water. The sea is rough.
The sea is rough.
Among the families, the smugglers. But no one gives them away. Everyone wants to make the crossing.
It would take 3 hours, 3 hours and a half with my boat. I can't do it. I saw too many dead children. The money is sweet for the ones who are doing it. Some of them are in jail now. But I saw the dead children. I couldn't do it. I could not put those people on my boat.
They leave from small coves, away from public view. On the beaches, the remnants of their departure. A child's shoe lost in the rush, a manual with instructions for dinghies, the wobbly little boats used to make the crossing. They have to learn how to use them quickly. The smugglers don't go to sea. In the harbour, a tent for the men, women and children stopped by the Turkish Coast Guards trying to cross to Greece. They're waiting to be transferred to a gymnasium in the town, a makeshift reception centre. This is something that the police do not want to be filmed. There are 55 migrants on this bus.
They are either given a temporary residence permit for a certain period of time, like a month or 10 days, or they'll be told to leave the country. This is not detention. This is for ID establishment. We kind of take them under protection.
In Dikili, the fishermen hope that the summer will put an end to the nightmare of their winter. But there is no illusion. Nothing will ever be the same as before.
Everything's changed. When I put my nets in the sea, I always think that they could also catch a human body. It's weird to think about that. I wonder what lies at the bottom of the sea.
A new deal between Turkey and the EU means that the migrants rejected by Europe will be deported back to Dikili. Even as summer comes, the fishermen know other tragedies are not far away.
And you can catch the full edition of The Reporters here on France 24 at 12:40 Paris time. Now, do stay with us. More news coming up. We'll be talking to our correspondent in Brazil on the historic Congress vote there in favour of impeaching President Dilma Rousseff. And in today's focus, we're in northern China at the coalface of the government's decision to close 1,000 mines this year. We'll be finding out what that means for the 1.3 million people likely to lose their jobs. Do stay with us.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news